So today on the podcast, we're continuing our story of Disney legend Mary Blair. In recent episodes, we've followed Mary as she shifted her role as a successful illustrator in New York back to being an art director at WED for Disney. In many cases, Walt kept artists that he particularly admired or trusted on projects that mattered the most to him. In the early 1940s, it was the South American films. In the early 1950s, it was that new wave of animated features, such as Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland, and Peter Pan. And in the early 1960s, it was the unique projects that he was creating for the World's Fair. Though a few artists made one of those leaps. For example, animator Frank Thomas moved from the South American projects to the feature films in the 1950s, and Herb Ryman moved from the South American projects to Disneyland and later the World's Fair projects. But no one other than Mary had decisive roles in all three areas. And today we move forward with one of her best-known projects, It's a Small World, as it begins to take on increased political importance against cultural unrest that was then moving across the country. Initially, the attraction, now called It's a Small World, had been arranged as a musical fantasy that radiated the fair's central theme, peace through understanding. But over the previous 4 or 5 months, it had taken on new layers of political meaning. The ride now echoed the politics of the civil rights movement, which was one of the key social causes championed by President John F. Kennedy, then in his third year of office. In June 1963, Kennedy delivered a televised address on the importance of the Civil Rights Act, to end racial segregation in public areas where it still existed, to integrate public schools, to strengthen voting rights for African Americans, to prohibit job discrimination based on race, and to prevent racially motivated violence, and to promote peace and understanding between people of all racial and ethnic backgrounds. In the weeks that followed, he worked to form bipartisan support for the act. Though this was never an overt goal of the Kennedy administration, most assumed that the act would be passed into law before the eyes of the world focused in on New York for the fair. But as Kennedy promoted the Civil Rights Act, many associated with the fair understood that its political goals, specifically racial harmony through equality, were also a centerpiece theme of that Disney attraction. During these same months, another theme that was emerging with greater strength was the connection between the attraction and the singular vision of Mary Blair. By the fall of 1963, most at WED saw Small World as an extension of Mary Blair's artistic vision. The addition of the new theme song by the Sherman Brothers only amplified the underlying sensibilities of Mary Blair's artistic world by emphasizing those themes in their lyrics. In this way, It's a Small World was now a journey through the imagination of Mary, with stages occupied by the type of joyous, trusting children she had first designed almost 25 years ago. Designs that over decades expanded into a personal style that identified her central vision. In this, the ride would be an artful journey on boats that offered guests a 10-minute display of happiness and bliss. It was just this, the single exuberant emotional tone of the attraction, that prompted Mary and Joyce Carlson to wonder if the ride needed an emotional counterpoint. Perhaps it could use a figure or display that reminded guests that the attraction represented a unique vision for a global community. Mary, more than most, understood that what they were creating was an idealized dream, something that didn't exist in the real world, so she and Joyce thought it might be useful to drop a small coded piece of reality into the ride. Their solution was to make a clown figure. He would be situated in the basket of a hot air balloon high above it all, slowly being lifted further from the harmony below. The clown wants to return to the peaceful pageant, but the balloon continues to carry him away. Mary and Joyce thought it might be situated in the final show area of the ride. "Oh, the little clown in the basket under the balloon," Carlson explained. "He's holding a sign saying, 'Help!' Mary designed that and I made it. He wants to get out of the basket, but we can't let him get out. He's frowning because he's floating away and wants to come back down with all the others." Even though Rolly had already made a Mary Blair doll with yellow chicken feathers to match Mary's blonde hair, this clown figure, from a certain perspective, was also perhaps a thematic representation of Mary inside the ride, one that was more accurate. Mary, every few weeks, was lifted up by plane, not by balloon, and carried away from the artistic harmony she experienced in California, and was returned to New York, where she did her best to inhabit pockets of warmth and support inside her home with Lee and the boys. She was able to create those pockets, moments where they had a nice afternoon on their boat or on a picnic, but the feelings that surrounded those activities were difficult to sustain. One of the largest problems was how much time Lee spent away from the house, mostly for work, though drinking was a growing issue. Even though her boys were now teenagers and presumably could cook and care for themselves, when Mary traveled to California, she made sure a maid was at the house. This was the maid they employed year-round, though her hours were expanded while Mary was gone, to cook and clean, which gave Mary the ability to focus on her work with fewer worries about her boys on the other side of the continent. While designers continued work on the attraction, Walt debuted a model of the Small World complex at a luncheon hosted by Robert Moses, president of the fair. Walt was joined by Herbert Barnett, president of Pepsi, and Helenka Pataglione, president of the United States Committee for UNICEF. The event only previewed the buildings and marquee themselves, as work was still active on the ride. Disney and the World's Fair had announced the theme and the general concept of the ride, but beyond this, specifics had not yet been released. Much of the forthcoming attraction still remains a well-kept secret, one reporter noted. Most of the animated characters, stylized sets, light and sound effects, and to some extent even the basic storyline are still under wraps. But Robert Moses, fair president, predicts that the exhibit will be one of the top 3 or 4 most popular attractions. The presentation was focused mostly on the model of the show building that would house the ride, what designers still called the barn, now dressed up with paint, decorations, and a lovely sign. The model also featured a miniature version of the Tower of the Four Winds, designed by Rolly Crump, which would sit atop a 2-story building designed to highlight the work of UNICEF in assisting more than 100 countries in the fight against hunger and disease. But none of the full structures were yet finished, not the show building, not the Tower of the Four Winds, not even the small display building to showcase the work UNICEF did with children. In California, designers worked to finish the attraction, synchronizing animation, developing a speaker arrangement to create a unified soundtrack for multi-part audio. The speakers would be carefully positioned to create a musical soundscape. As boats approached the South American section, for example, the sounds of a Peruvian flute would enter the melody, and as boats moved away from the South American section, the Peruvian flute would fade. Same for bagpipes in the Ireland section, and for stringed instruments in the Japanese section. As each of the 5 themed stages were structurally complete, they were transported over to the studio for finishing touches and for Walt to review. "We set it up exactly the way it was going to be in New York," Rolly Crump explained. By this point, live-action production on Mary Poppins had wrapped, and the sets had been struck, leaving space for Small World to be installed and reviewed inside a studio soundstage. We lit the sets and added the music, Rowley continued. One goal now was to make sure the stages were dressed and arranged to Mary and Rowley's specifications, something that was easier to judge in the controlled environment of the sound stages rather than at workspace at WED or Grosh. Mary's niece Maggie, a UCLA student, accompanied Mary on one of these walkthroughs. We walked around it. It was all in white, and then Mary carried the lights around so you could see the colored lights and how it would be. When they reached the figures of a young girl and her geese, Mary pointed to the birds and explained that those still weren't finished, that they'd need decorative ribbons around their tall, feathery necks. "So what do you think?" Mary asked. "What color do you think the ribbon should be?" Maggie replied, "Green." Mary considered this, smiling a little, as though in her mind she was working through various shades of green to see which would best fit this area. But from her niece's perspective, color wasn't the important thing. Rather, it was the question itself. "Well, it made me feel part of what she was doing," she explained, "part of the beautiful world that existed at Disney. And she made me feel special, and that's the way she worked with everybody." One of the key purposes of this final arrangement was to allow Walt to formally review the stages. As this was an indoor water flume ride, and as no flume was available at the studio, craftspeople designed a small wheeled platform that would work like a boat, specifically so Walt could see the stages from the same vantage point as guests seated in the actual boats in New York. This would be his way to check sight lines within the ride before signing off on the stages. According to Marty Sklar, they built a small rolling wooden buck, also a miniature version of a boat that would be used in the actual ride. They put the boat on top of it, he said, so that you were at eye level with the way you would see it on the ride, and they'd push that through a route so that we could see what the show was going to look like. In terms of design review, Walt was a physical person. When his company designed rides, he liked to see physical models and full mock-ups. Walt didn't want to be fooled by a drawing, Sklar continued, or by a layout that an architect had done, so eventually everything was done dimensionally. Walt wanted a sense of how guests would experience the ride while elements could still be changed, and so he sat in the makeshift wooden boat as a couple of technicians wheeled him past each stage, as the song by the Sherman Brothers played, and as the little rubberheads, now dressed in costumes from around the world, lifted their arms, kicked their legs, and rhythmically shifted their little bodies back and forth. It was during this period that a national tragedy struck, a tragedy that also affected, in small but important ways, the role that this ride would play at the fair. On the morning of November 22nd, President John F. Kennedy flew on Air Force One into Dallas as part of a 2-day trip to strengthen the Democratic Party in Texas as the nation slowly moved toward an election year. He and his wife Jacqueline were met at the airport by a cheering crowd of at least 3,000 spectators. Kennedy had been warned by the Secret Service about possible threats in Texas, against him as a person and against his political positions, including the Civil Rights Act. But disregarding these warnings, he walked toward the crowd and shook hands as the Secret Service watched. Kennedy stayed with the crowd for a few minutes before the service safely ushered him into a black 1961 Lincoln Continental convertible, which would be part of the motorcade that took the presidential party into town, where Kennedy was scheduled to give one of many short talks in Texas, this time at the Dallas Trade Mart. Because the weather was nice, and likely because Kennedy liked to connect with fellow Americans, a decision was made to keep the top down so he could see people and they could see him. This likely was a tragic error in judgment. As the car passed through Dealey Plaza, a 24-year-old former Marine named Lee Harvey Oswald stood at a sixth-floor window of the Texas School Book Depository, holding a bolt-action rifle with the sights narrowed in on Kennedy's car. He likely took a first shot that missed, but a subsequent shot hit Kennedy in the head and killed him. There is no record of Mary's reaction to the assassination, though it would be reasonable to assume, especially as 3 years earlier, she'd received a letter of praise from Jacqueline Kennedy about her book, I Can Fly, that she was upset by the news. But there is a record of Walt's reaction. On the day Kennedy was assassinated, Walt was on the company plane coming home from Florida. He'd been there to scout locations for a new Disneyland and was airborne at the time of the actual shooting. The pilot received no general news reports from ground communication. Only when they touched down in Louisiana for the night did they learn what had happened. Disney executive Card Walker explained how events played out from there. We'd landed in New Orleans. We were riding in our cars. I was in one car. Walt was in a car behind us. And we saw people in their cars being disturbed, and we couldn't figure out what in the hell it was. We finally turned on our radio, and we pieced together that Kennedy had been shot in Dallas. When we got to the hotel in New Orleans, Walt came in behind, and I walked over and told him, "We just heard, Walt, that the president has been shot." He was shocked. Though the assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, wasn't tied to causes that were either for or against the civil rights movement, many people at the time assumed that the assassination was related to the president's desire for social change. Without Kennedy, the Civil Rights Act would clearly take more time to move through Congress, if it passed at all. His assassination also increased national discussion about civil rights, along with related demonstrations and protests, and would deepen the desire for many protections of equality that the act would arrange into federal law. In this environment, the concept of a World's Fair in New York was changing. For many, Kennedy's death marked the moment when comfortable beliefs and assumptions about American life were crumbling, replaced by a growing sense of strife, not only about civil rights, but a growing sense of generational divide between parents and teenagers, as well as concerns about increased military involvement in Vietnam. In these weeks, the national psyche shifted toward a darker outlook. As a result, the New York World's Fair, with its themes of cultural harmony and technological optimism, was framed as a hopeful future vision for the world, despite social unrest that was unfolding in pockets across the country. In this environment, fair executives and promoters understood that Small World could be a more significant symbol of the fair's main theme than they initially had believed. The ride featured children from around the world presented in a consistent style that suggested equality, while at the same time removing global hierarchies and other power constructs from its presentation to celebrate an international community among children. For a nation experiencing both grief and unrest, this ride would now have an expanded subtext. It would echo those cultural goals once championed by an assassinated American president. During this period of national grieving, Mary and her team continued to work on the ride. Engineers adjusted the mechanical animation of the rubber heads, and audio technicians continued to work with speaker placement. The goal was to finalize the ride as much as possible so it could be crated up and trucked to New York. Once the ride was installed there, designers could still make small adjustments to better fit show elements for its show building, but those adjustments would be minor. Most work needed to be completed in California. In terms of design staff still working on the ride, it was now mostly down to just Mary and Raleigh. By this point, Raleigh's relationship with Mary was changing. Raleigh had strong feelings of closeness with Mary, a sense of admiration and personal connection in terms of art. He revered her and wondered at the design she had made for Small World. He often used words like love to define his relationship with her, but was careful to explain that for him, this type of love was a regard for her as an artist and as a friend. Mary and I were very close, he said. I was in love with her, but as a goddess, not as a woman or as a person. I was so thrilled to be with her. Unlike other artists that wed, Mary never looked down at Raleigh because he was far younger than most every other designer on a World's Fair project. For her, they were equals. That December, before flying back to New York, Mary decided to spend time with her family up by San Jose. Once again, Walt offered to fly her up on the company plane. The official reason would, as always, be listed as delivering film to a processing lab, but the flight was arranged to fit Mary's schedule. Another expression of Walt's support for Mary and the work she did on his projects. As time was now of the essence, on that trip she took some work with her. Mary was over at my mother and dad's, her niece recalled, and we were all down on the floor and she was rolling out the paper and showing us how the ride was going to be. She had some styrofoam cutouts and was all excited about it. A couple days later, she flew back to Burbank and spent a little time at the studio. The attraction now was in good shape. Then she flew home to celebrate the holidays with Lee and her boys. Christmas still remained one of her favorite times of the year. As the 5 stages were finalized and prepared for shipment, one of the last design battles for Small World concerned the artistic marquee that would rise over 100 feet above the show building, the Tower of the Four Winds. Rolly Crump's original model was nimble and whimsical, slender piping, supporting an aerial arrangement of animal cutouts and propellers. But Raleigh was an artist, not an engineer, and didn't understand how the tower would need to be constructed in terms of structural loads and to withstand periods of high winds. To solve these issues, outside engineers contracted by Disney widened out its legs to support the 200,000 pounds of aluminum necessary to finish its construction. They worked on this project most of fall and into the new year. In January 1964, Walt explained to Raleigh that the tower was finished and needed to be inspected. Walt, who didn't particularly like driving, asked Raleigh if he would give the two of them a ride over to the grounds owned by the Keylight and Xeon corporations. They walked out to the car and Raleigh opened the doors. Once seated, Walt looked over at Raleigh, one eyebrow slightly raised. "Put on your seatbelt and let's go," he said. Raleigh sat there for a moment, not moving much. As a young man in his early 30s, he rarely wore a seatbelt. But then he realized that he likely would never disobey Walt, not even in his own car. He clipped the belt closed across his lap and started the engine. Crump then drove them over to North Main Street in Los Angeles, just north of downtown, where the Keylight Corporation had erected the finished mobile for inspection. Keylight was located in an industrial section of the city, between Chinatown and Mission Junction, with the cement-lined LA River on one side and multiple railroad tracks for Union Station on the other. Nearby businesses included a sign shop and a roofing company, small businesses surrounded by dirt. It was there that Keylight had assembled the tower for inspection, a massive structure similar to a building 10 stories tall. It was a rise of bright color that stood out in a neighborhood dominated by tones of gray, beige, and dust. Raleigh stepped out from the car to look at how engineers had reconfigured his design, now 110 feet tall. Supporting beams were wider, chunkier than Raleigh had envisioned. Engineers had also thickened elements to protect the tower from wind loads it might experience during hurricane season. Raleigh's mouth opened slightly as he took in the full structure for the first time. It still held his moving elements, roughly 100 in all: animals, birds, fish, images of the sun, and propellers. But the structure seemed heavier now, less elegant. "To be honest," he explained, "I was originally pretty put off by the tower's construction. The little 6-inch diameter pipes I designed became 12 inches so it could hold itself up. I wasn't too happy with it." Around the structure were also a couple reporters and a photographer, likely set up by the Keylight Corporation to solidify their contribution to the Disney-designed attractions at the World's Fair. Walt explained that this structure would be integrated around and above one of the buildings at the fair site, which would in part showcase UNICEF's work with children. "We've attempted to combine an It's a Small World theme with a salute to the world's children," Walt explained. "The colors of every flag in the world will be presented somewhere in the mobile." When the short press conference was over and the reporters were dispersing, Walt turned to Raleigh, his face holding a small satisfaction. "Well, Raleigh, what do you think?" Raleigh, who is never one to hide his true feelings, said, "I hate to tell you, Walt, but I think it's a piece of crap." Walt leaned in a little, his eyes angled up to meet Raleigh's. He wasn't angry, but his tone now was firm. "What?" he said. Again, Raleigh said, "It's a piece of crap." "No," Walt replied, "it can't be. It cost me $200,000, Roland. It can't be a piece of crap." Raleigh explained how the pipes were too fat, the structure too chunky, its overall feel different than what he had expected. Then Walt's tone softened. "Roland," he said, "you've got to deal with the engineers when you want something designed, and you have to bow to what they want to do." He mentioned again about the possibilities of strong winds in New York, especially during hurricane season. Raleigh indicated that he understood. He also knew it was useless to argue with Walt, a man nearly double his age, and so he simply accepted it, that this would be the version of the tower that would be crated up and shipped on 7 trucks to New York. Raleigh also knew there were other things to focus on: the attraction itself, and also a TV show that Walt was making to support his projects at the fair, a show on which he would appear as would Mary. And so, with a quiet note of defeat, Raleigh walked with Walt back to his car, where once more he put on his seatbelt in deference to Walt, and then he drove the two of them back to the studio. Again, a different outro for today. As you probably know, my new book, Making Mary Poppins, will be out this week on November 11th from Norton. There's already been some publicity. There will be other events announced soon, but if you happen to live in either Southern California or Florida, I have a few things to announce today. On Sunday, November 23rd, in Tampa, I'll be at the Oxford Exchange to read and sign books. If you can't make this event, I will also tape a segment for the morning talk show Daytime on the local NBC affiliate to be aired in the second week of December. On December 1st, I'll be in Los Angeles at Book Soup. On December 7th, I'll be in Miami at the Coral Gables location for Books and Books. And on December 18th, I'll be at the Burbank Public Library in Burbank, California. So if you happen to live near any of these cities and want to come out and say hi, I would love to see you there. Most of the events are free. There's a small $6 venue charge for the Tampa event, But also, most of these events ask you to reserve a seat online to make sure everyone has a space. Again, I'll have more dates to add in the weeks ahead, but as the venues have posted these already, I'm announcing them here as well. You can find links to buy the book in the show notes today, and you can also find links to the 4 events I mentioned as well. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you will find over 300 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in our show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.